The voice reached Homer Merritt before anything else did, drifting through the canvas wall of the general store tent like smoke, finding its way through a cracked window. Low and melodic, and carrying the kind of quiet certainty that made a man stop mid-stride and forget entirely what he had been doing. It was the autumn of 1873, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat at the edge of the cattle country like a man leaning over a cliff, half reckless and half hopeful. Its dirt streets churned to mud by the constant passage of longhorn herds and the boots of drovers who came through flush with trail wages, and left the same way they arrived, hungry for something they could not quite name. Homer had ridden with one such outfit for the better part of 3 months, pushing cattle up from Texas along the Kishom Trail, and now the drive was done, the cattle sold, and the crew scattered like seeds in a September wind. He stood outside the canvas-walled general store that served as the temporary mercantile for the season, his hat in his hand, his dark hair pressed flat against his forehead from the long wearing of it, his boots cracked along the right toe where the leather had dried too fast after a creek crossing back in the Indian Territory. He had been about to go inside and purchase a new pair, or at least some oil to soften the old ones. He had been thinking about boots and nothing else, and then that voice came through the canvas. It was a woman's voice, unhurried and clear as creek water over smooth stones, saying, "I understand the flour is expensive, sir, and I am not arguing your price is unfair. I am only asking whether you have any credit arrangements for homesteaders who are waiting on their first harvest payment. I have 3 children to feed and a pantry that is mostly empty air and good intentions." There was a pause, and then the woman continued, with a calm dignity that somehow made the words land harder than anger would have. "I am not asking for charity. I am asking for a business arrangement. There is a difference, and I suspect a man in commerce understands that distinction." Homer did not move. He stood in the pale October light with his hat still in his hand and listened to the store owner, a squat man named Pullem who smelled of cured leather and old coffee, murmur something about ledger books and risk and the hard nature of extending credit in boom towns. And then the woman's voice came again, steady as a compass needle finding north. "Then I will pay what I have today, which is 73 cents, and I will return with the remainder by the end of the month. I give you my word, and I will sign whatever paper you require." Homer put his hat back on his head, pulled it down level, and walked through the canvas flap into the store. The light inside was amber and dusty, filtered through the yellowing canvas above, and it took his eyes a moment to adjust from the brightness of the October afternoon. Shelves ran along 3 walls, crowded with tins and sacks and bolts of cloth. Barrels of crackers and pickles stood in a loose row near the entrance. And at the counter, standing with her back to him and her shoulders held very straight in a way that told him she was working hard to appear untroubled, was a woman in a dark blue dress with a hem that had seen considerable prairie mud and considerable careful mending both. Her hair was the color of autumn oak leaves. A deep reddish-brown shot through with strands of copper, and it was pinned up in the practical manner of a woman who did not have time to fuss with it, but had taken care with it anyway. Homer walked to the counter, set down a $5 coin beside the woman's 73 cents, and said to Pullem, without any particular fuss or flourish, "Put whatever she needs on my account. I will settle the balance before I leave town." There was a silence that stretched out like taffy. The woman turned around. He had not yet seen her face when he spoke, had not planned to speak at all, had simply heard the voice and made a decision the way he sometimes made decisions on the trail, fast, instinctive, without the intervention of careful thought. But when she turned and he saw her face for the first time, something happened to the inside of his chest that he did not have proper words for, not then and not for a long time afterward. She was perhaps 24 or 25 years old, with a face that was both pretty and practical, dark eyes that were sharp with intelligence, and at this particular moment, sharp with something considerably close to anger. Her cheekbones were high and her jaw was firm, and there was a small scar above her left eyebrow that looked like it had come from something that happened a long time ago, some childhood accident or another, and it only added to the impression she gave of being a person who had lived a real life and was not ashamed of it. She looked at him for a long, assessing moment, and he looked back at her without apology. "I did not ask for your help," she said. "No, ma'am," he agreed. "You did not. I am fully capable of managing my own affairs." "I heard that clearly. You made a very good argument." She glanced at the coin he had placed on the counter and then back at his face, and he could see her working through several different responses the way a person works through several different doors in a burning building, looking for the one that leads somewhere useful. Finally, she said, "I will repay you." "That is entirely up to you," Homer said. "I am not keeping track." Pulam, sensing that the conversation had moved somewhere beyond his participation, quietly began assembling flour, salt, dried beans, and a small canister of baking powder on the counter. The woman watched him for a moment, then turned back to Homer. "Julia Keene," she said, and extended her hand with the directness of someone who had long ago decided that certain social niceties were too time-consuming to bother with. He shook it. Her grip was firm, her palm calloused in the way of a person who worked with their hands daily and did not apologize for it. "Homer Merritt, you are a drover. Just finished a drive. Heading back to Texas in a week or so, I expect, unless something changes my direction." She looked at him again with those sharp, dark eyes, and he had the distinct impression that she was not merely looking at him but calculating something, the way a rancher looks at a horse before deciding whether it is worth the price being asked. Then she nodded, as if she had reached a conclusion that satisfied her, turned back to the counter and said to Pulam, "Add a half-pound of coffee to that, please. I have had none in 3 weeks and I am beginning to lose my sense of proportion." Homer almost smiled. He swallowed it. He carried her supplies out to her wagon, which was parked in the street outside, a battered old thing with a mended wheel and a mule named. He learned Sergeant, on account of the way the animal ordered everyone around by ignoring them completely. There were 3 children in the wagon bed, 2 boys and a girl, ranging from perhaps 4 to 9 years in age, all of them with their mother's dark eyes and the cautious, watching manner of children who have learned that strangers can mean any number of things, and it is best to wait and see. The oldest boy, who gave his name as Thomas with great seriousness, helped Homer load the supplies with the careful dignity of someone who has recently decided that he is the man of the household and is working to grow into the role. "Your husband is not in town?" Homer asked, keeping his voice easy and light, watching the side of Julia's face as she checked the mule's harness. "My husband passed 2 winters ago," she said, without particular grief in her voice, though Homer suspected the grief was there, just put somewhere interior where it did not interfere with the daily business of survival. "Fever. I am sorry." "Thank you." She tightened a buckle with practiced efficiency. "We have managed. I can see that you have." She climbed up to the wagon seat and gathered the reins and looked down at him with an expression he could not entirely read, which was not a thing he was accustomed to. Homer Merritt had always been reasonably good at reading people. It was a useful skill on the trail, knowing which drovers would hold steady in a storm and which ones would make trouble after 2 drinks. But Julia Keene was, from the first moment, something of a different proposition. "Thank you, Mr. Merritt," she said. "For the supplies I will repay you. You said that already. I meant it both times." She clicked her tongue at Sergeant, and the mule moved off down the muddy street with the mild indignation of an animal who considers all forward motion beneath his dignity, but is willing to accommodate it. Homer watched the wagon until it turned at the far end of the street, and then he stood in the October light for a moment, alone, before he went back inside to buy his boot oil. That night he ate supper at the Drover's Rest, which was the only establishment in Caldwell that passed for a proper eating house, and he drank 1 cup of coffee, and then another while the other men around him played cards and talked loudly about cattle prices and weather and the general indignity of the cattle trade. He thought about the voice he had heard through the canvas wall, steady and dignified and entirely unintimidated. He thought about the face he had seen when she turned around, the high cheekbones and the sharp dark eyes and the small scar above the left eyebrow. He thought about 3 children in a wagon bed, and a mule named Sergeant, and a farm that apparently had a pantry full of empty air and good intentions. He thought, somewhat against his own inclinations, that he would like to hear that voice again. The next morning he made inquiries, in the careful and indirect manner of a man who does not wish to appear to be doing what he is in fact doing, and learned from a garrulous old-timer named Webb who sat outside the livery, and considered it his personal duty to know everything about everyone in a 50-mile radius, that Julia Keene had a homestead claim about 8 miles east of town, on a section of land her husband had filed on 2 years before he died. She had a 160-acre parcel, a 2-room soddy, and the 3 children, and she had been working the claim herself with help from her oldest boy Thomas, who was 9 and apparently as serious about farming as he was about being the man of the household. "She going to make it?" Homer asked, keeping his eyes on the middle distance, as if the question were only mild and passing. Webb squinted at him with the shrewd eyes of a man who has been underestimated his entire life and finds it useful. "Woman like that, I expect she might. Got more backbone than most men I have met and better sense than all of them, but it is hard going out there on a claim alone. Ground is cooperative enough if you know how to work it, but there is always something, drought or grasshoppers or prices dropping or the banker deciding your note is due. One thing goes wrong and it all goes wrong." He paused and spat with precision into the street. "Hard for a woman alone." Homer nodded. He thanked Webb and walked back to the livery where his horse, a steady dun gelding named Pharaoh, was eating hay with the philosophical contentment of a horse who knows that the good days are to be savored, because they do not last. Homer saddled him and rode east out of Caldwell, telling himself he was only going to have a look at the land, which was not entirely untrue. He found the Keene homestead without difficulty, following Webb's directions, and he sat on Pharaoh at the edge of the lane that led up to the soddy, and looked at the place with the assessing eye of a man who had spent years evaluating what a piece of land could do and what it could not. The house was solid enough for a soddy, the walls thick and the roof freshly resodded where a section had collapsed. A kitchen garden ran along the south side, mostly harvested now but carefully tended, the rows still visible and neat. A small barn, more ambition than lumber, housed what appeared to be 2 goats and a handful of chickens. The field beyond had been plowed under for the season, the dark earth turned up in even rows. She had done a great deal here, alone and with a child's help, and he found himself quietly impressed in the way he was impressed by things that were genuinely difficult and genuinely accomplished. Julia came out of the soddy door before he could decide what to do next, wiping her hands on her apron, and looked up at him with no particular surprise and no particular welcome, though neither was there hostility. She had the manner of someone who has learned to wait and see before committing to a reaction. "Mr. Merritt, Mrs. Keene." He took off his hat. "I apologize for coming out unannounced. I was riding east and I thought I would see if there was anything that needed doing." She looked at him for a moment, then she looked at the barn, then back at him. "The corner post on the barn is rotting at the base. I have been meaning to replace it for 6 weeks, but I cannot lift the corner of the roof long enough to pull the old post and set the new one. I have a post cut but not enough hands. I could help with that. I expect you could." He dismounted and tied Pharaoh to the fence, and she led him to the barn, and they spent the better part of 2 hours replacing the post, with Thomas handing tools with great seriousness and the younger boy, whose name was Charlie and who was 6, watching from a safe distance with enormous eyes and a stick he had decided was some kind of weapon. The little girl, 4-year-old Annie, had fallen asleep in the kitchen garden with her cheek on a pile of dead vine cuttings, and seemed entirely unconcerned with the structural integrity of the barn. It was hard, close work, and Julia worked beside him without complaint, and without any of the false helplessness that some women performed when a man was present. She knew what she was doing. She had clearly done most of this kind of work herself before, and she simply incorporated him into the task the way you incorporate a useful tool, without ceremony and without waste of effort. When it was done, she stood back and looked at the mended corner and said, "Good," in the tone of someone checking something off a list. "You have a well-managed place here," Homer said. She looked at him sideways. "It is a work in progress. Most things worth having are." She made coffee over the fire inside the soddy, and he sat at the rough table and drank it from a tin cup, while Thomas did his lessons at the other end of the table, with the grim concentration of a small person who has been told that education is important and has decided to believe it absolutely. Charlie had appointed himself to sit as close to Homer as was physically possible without actually sitting in his lap, staring at him with the frank curiosity of a 6-year-old who has no investment in social discretion. Annie had woken up from her garden nap and was now standing in the doorway eating a biscuit and regarding Homer with the scientific detachment of a very small person conducting an important study. "Where are you from?" Julia asked, setting the coffee pot back on the stove. "Originally from Missouri. Been working cattle out of Texas for about 4 years now." "Do you have family?" "A sister in Missouri. Our parents died when we were young. She is married to a good man with a farm and they do fine." Julia sat down across the table from him with her own cup, and she looked at him with the direct attention she seemed to give to everything, as if half measures in anything were a kind of dishonesty she was unwilling to participate in. "Why did you help me in the store yesterday?" He considered giving her a simple answer and decided against it. "I heard your voice before I saw you, through the canvas. You were talking to Pullem about credit arrangements." He paused. "There was something in the way you were talking. Like you were not afraid, but you knew the ground was hard and you were going to keep walking on it anyway." He turned his cup in his hands. "I wanted to help." She was quiet for a moment. "That is an honest answer. I try. Most men who help a widow with children have an expectation attached to the help." "I expect some do," he agreed. "Do you?" He met her eyes directly. "No, ma'am. I help because I wanted to. I came out here today because I wanted to. I will leave when you tell me to, and I will not be put out by it." She looked at him for another long moment, and then she said with the faintest softening around her eyes, "Drink your coffee, Mr. Merritt. It is getting cold." He rode back to town that evening in the long light of October, and the prairie stretched out in every direction, golden and vast and indifferent in the way that only very large spaces can be indifferent. And he thought that he had not felt this particular kind of restlessness in a long time, the restlessness that is not dissatisfaction but its opposite, the restlessness of a man who has been moving for years and has suddenly, without warning, caught a glimpse of where he might want to stop. Over the next 2 weeks, Homer Merritt found reasons to ride east from Caldwell with a frequency that Webb the old-timer noted with the satisfied expression of a man who has seen exactly this sort of thing before, and finds it entirely predictable and entirely gratifying. He helped Julia turn the last of the kitchen garden under for winter. He split a considerable quantity of firewood and stacked it against the south wall of the soddy. He mended a gap in the fence that Sargent had clearly been investigating with criminal intent. He found and patched a leak in the roof that Julia had not yet located, tracking it back from the interior water stain to an exterior gap with the patient methodology of a man who finds problems interesting. In return, Julia fed him supper at the rough table with the children, good plain food that she made taste better than it had any right to with careful seasoning and attention. And she talked to him with the same direct intelligence she brought to everything. And he talked back. And gradually, the conversation between them deepened the way good well water deepens if you keep digging, past the surface level of farm business and practical matters, down into the territory of ideas and memories, and the larger questions that people ask each other when they are beginning to trust. She told him about Ohio, where she had grown up, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had kept an immaculate house, and harbored a secret passion for reading novels that she pursued after the children were in bed. She had come west with her husband Julia Keene in 1868, when the Homestead Act was still new, and the land was being offered with an enthusiasm that sometimes outran the reality of what growing things on the Kansas prairie actually required. Daniel had been a good man, she said, careful and decent, not gifted with the physical robustness that farming demanded, but willing and persistent. He had worked himself hard, and the fever had found him tired and unable to fight it. "Were you happy?" Homer asked, one evening in November when the first cold had come and they sat beside the stove after the children were in bed, and he knew as soon as the words left his mouth that the question was more intimate than anything he had said before, that he was moving into different territory, and he watched her face to see if she would retreat from it. She did not retreat. She thought about it with the genuine consideration she gave to all things. "We were good," she said finally. "He was a good man and I cared for him greatly. Happy is a large word. I do not think I know yet what my version of it fully looks like. But with Daniel I was content, and I was not alone, and those are not small things." "No," Homer agreed. "They are not small things." She looked into the fire for a moment. "What about you? Have you been happy?" He thought about the trail, the long days in the saddle and the nights under stars, and the constant motion that had satisfied something in him for years and had slowly, without his noticing when it began, stopped satisfying it. "I have been free," he said, "and for a long time I thought those were the same thing." She looked at him then with an expression that was warm and a little sad and very knowing, and he thought that look was the most beautiful thing her face had ever done, which was considerable, given that her face was generally a rather beautiful thing. "They are not the same," she said quietly. "No," he said, "I am beginning to understand that." The winter came in early and hard, the way Kansas winters do, without apology, dropping several feet of snow in a single week in December, and rendering the road between Caldwell and the Keene homestead essentially impassable for the better part of a month. Homer had been planning to winter in Texas, had told his former trail boss Ike Sanderson that he would likely be back for the spring drive. But when the snow came, he found himself not particularly anxious to leave, and he arranged to spend the winter in Caldwell, boarding with a family named Hutchins who ran the boarding house and were glad of the income during the quiet winter months. He rode out to Julia's claim whenever the weather allowed, and when it did not he thought about riding out, which was perhaps more telling. He brought supplies when he came, contributing to the winter stores with the matter-of-fact generosity of a man who has decided that a thing is worth doing and does not see the point in making a great ceremony of it. Julia accepted this in the same spirit, without excessive gratitude that would have embarrassed them both, and without pretending that the help was not needed or welcome. The children had warmed to him by degrees. Thomas had been the most deliberate about it, evaluating Homer over the course of several weeks with the careful judgment of a 9-year-old, who has appointed himself the protective assessment committee for his family, and who takes the appointment very seriously. He had finally announced his approval one afternoon in November while they were splitting wood together, saying, without preamble, "You are not trying to be our father, are you?" in the tone of a small person asking a large and important question. Homer had set down the splitting axe and considered this with the respect it deserved. "No," he said, "I would not presume to replace someone who was your father and who I never knew. What I am is a friend, and a friend of your mother's, and I hope eventually a friend of yours, if you are willing." Thomas had picked up a piece of firewood and turned it over in his hands, examining it with great attention that was not really about the wood at all. Then he said, "That seems all right," and that was that. Charlie had required no such deliberation and had simply climbed into Homer's affections the way a puppy climbs into a lap, without permission and without any apparent concern about whether it was wanted, which it very much was. Annie had pronounced him nice, After he had spent 20 minutes helping her build an elaborate house out of corn cobs, which Homer understood to be the highest possible endorsement from a 4-year-old, and was appropriately honored by it. On Christmas Day, the snow was thick on the ground, but the sky was clear and sharp and blue as new steel, and Homer arrived at the Keene homestead before noon with a small turkey he had managed to trade for in town, a pound of horehound candy for the children, and a book of poetry for Julia that he had found in the back of the general store, having noticed in one of their conversations that she had read and loved poetry before the years of practical necessity had left little time for it. He had not been sure of himself with that gift, had held the slim volume in his hands in the store and wondered if it was too much, too personal, too much like a declaration. He had bought it anyway. She opened the package at the table after dinner while the children were occupied with their candy, and when she saw the book she was quiet for a moment, running her thumb across the cover, and then she looked up at him with an expression that he would carry with him for the rest of his life, a look of being genuinely seen, genuinely known, genuinely given something that was chosen for her, and not for a general idea of a woman. "Homer," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of his name in that voice, the voice he had heard through a canvas wall in October before he ever saw her face, made something in him simply and completely certain. "Merry Christmas, Julia," he said. They were quiet together for a moment while the fire talked, and the children argued cheerfully about the relative merits of the different colored horehound pieces, and it was the kind of quiet that is not empty but full, the kind that two people can only share if something real has grown between them. The winter wore on through January and into February, with the particular grindstone patience of a Kansas winter that has decided it likes the place and is in no hurry to leave. Homer continued to come when the weather allowed, and when a 3-day blizzard in late January made the road entirely impossible for the better part of a week, he was surprised to find himself genuinely worried, not about anything specific, but about the general fact of Julia and the children being 8 miles away in weather that was pressing down on the prairie with indifferent force. When the road cleared enough to travel, he went immediately, and she met him at the door before he had fully dismounted, and he could tell from the faint lines around her eyes that the week had been harder than she would volunteer, the fuel lower, the children more frightened of the noise and weight of the storm than she had let them see. He stacked wood for 2 hours, and she made coffee and did not thank him but said, when he was finally seated at the table with the cup warming his hands, "I was glad to see you coming up the lane," in the quiet tone of someone making an admission of some importance. "I was glad to be coming," he said. She looked at him across the table, and he looked back, and the room was warm with the stove and the particular warmth of two people who have arrived, without planning to, at a moment of mutual understanding that changes the geography between them. "I need to tell you something," Julia said. "All right. I have been trying to be practical about you." She said it without apology, in the same direct way she said all things. "I have been reminding myself that you came through on a cattle drive and you will go back on the next one, and that there is no sense in—" She paused, chose her next words with care. "No sense in becoming accustomed to something that is likely temporary." "That is a practical thing to think," he said. "Yes, but I find that I am not succeeding at it." She met his eyes steadily. "And I thought you should know that." Homer set down his coffee cup very carefully, the way a man sets down something he is treating with great respect. "Julia," he said, "I sent a letter to Ike Sanderson in December. I told him I would not be on the spring drive." She was still watching him. "I wrote to my sister in Missouri about land values in this part of Kansas." He paused. "I have been talking to a fellow in town about the possibility of running a small horse operation, breaking and selling horses to the Army contracts, which are plentiful right now and pay reliably." He looked at his hands and then back at her face. "I have been thinking about what it would mean to stay." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of all the things that both of them had been carefully not saying for 4 months, and now all of those unsaid things were present in the room between them, patient and luminous and waiting. "Why?" Julia asked. The word was quiet and direct, the way all her words were. "Because I heard your voice through a canvas wall in October," he said, "and I walked through the door and I saw your face, and I have not been able to think straight since either one." He looked at her without pretense or performance. "Because you are the most capable and the most honest and the most quietly remarkable person I have met in my life, and I do not want to ride away from that. Not if you will let me stay." Julia Keene was not a woman who cried easily or often, and she did not cry now, but there was a brightness in her dark eyes that was close to it, and she let it be there without trying to manage it away. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers. "I think," she said after a moment, "that I would like to let you stay." Spring came to the Kansas prairie the way it always does, not with delicacy but with great force and color, the grass coming up green and urgent after the snow, the sky opening up to a blue so deep and clean it made the eyes ache pleasantly. The creek a quarter-mile from Julia's homestead ran high with snowmelt, and the cottonwood trees along its banks put out their leaves in a rush of pale green that trembled in every passing wind. Homer had taken up residence in the small barn that winter, with Julia's practical agreement and the children's delighted approval, converting a corner of it into a serviceable sleeping area with a rope cot and a blanket chest, and a small stove that Webb the old-timer had sold him for $2 on the grounds that he was getting too old to carry it around, and someone ought to use it. It was cold and drafty, but Homer had lived in considerably worse conditions on the trail, and the proximity to the family felt like a gift he was careful not to take for granted. In March, he filed on a parcel of land adjacent to Julia's claim, 3 sections to the east along the same creek, good land with water access and reasonable grass. He paid the filing fee from his trail wages and began planning what could be done with it, talking through the ideas with Julia in the evenings after the children were in bed, her practical intelligence shaping and improving his thinking in ways that repeatedly surprised him with their accuracy. She knew this land. She had learned it in the way that only hard experience teaches, through 2 seasons of working it, through error and adjustment, and the patient accumulation of specific knowledge about what grew here and when and how, and what refused to grow no matter what you did. Homer found himself listening to her the way he would listen to the best trail boss he had ever worked for, with the complete attention of someone who understands that the person talking knows things he does not, and that listening well is a form of intelligence. They talked about combining the operations, his land and hers, running cattle and horses both, keeping a proper kitchen garden and expanding it. They talked about building a proper house, lumber rather than sod, when there was enough money. They talked about Thomas's schooling and whether the town school was sufficient or whether they should supplement it. They talked about everything in the comfortable and honest way of 2 people who have established between themselves that honesty is the foundation and everything else is built on it. In April, on a Sunday afternoon when the weather was mild, and the children had been turned loose outside to run off the accumulated energy of a long winter, Homer found Julia at the creek's edge, sitting on a flat rock with her shoes off and her feet in the water, her face turned up to the sun, with an expression of pure uncomplicated pleasure that he had not seen on her before, an unguarded happiness that was different from her usual capable composure, and that made her, he thought with a kind of quiet wonder, more beautiful than he had words for. He sat down on the rock beside her without ceremony, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. "This is my favorite place on the claim," she said, without opening her eyes. "I can see why. Daniel found it in the first week we were here." He said. She paused, and her voice carried the familiar quality of someone accessing a memory that is both tender and a little worn at the edges. He said that any land with a creek like this running through it had something good in it at the core. Homer was quiet for a moment, giving that the space it deserved. He was right about that. She opened her eyes and looked at the water. I am grateful for what we had, and I am grateful for what is now. She looked at him then with her direct, dark eyes. Both things can be true at once. Yes, he said. They can. He reached over and took her hand, and she let him hold it, and they sat there in the April sun with the creek talking over its stones, and the cottonwood leaves making their bright, restless sound in the wind, and the world felt very large and very full and very kind. He asked her to marry him on a Thursday in May, which was not the most romantic day of the week, but was the day it happened, because the moment was real and present, and he was not the kind of man to wait for a better day when the right one was standing in front of him. They were mending fence together along the eastern edge of her claim, or rather she was handing him wire and he was working the fence pliers, which was more or less how all their projects went, her steady practical assistance giving his efforts their direction and efficiency. He set down the pliers and turned to her and said, "Julia, I would like to marry you if you will have me. I am not a wealthy man, but I am a working one, and I intend to build something here that is worth the building, and I would like very much to build it with you. I love you. I have loved you since October, and I expect I will love you until there is no more of me to do it with." She looked at him for a long, clear moment, and then she said, "Yes." Not a complicated yes, not a conditional or a hesitant one. Just yes in the voice that he had first heard through a canvas wall and that he had never once since tired of hearing, direct and certain and warm. He kissed her there beside the half-mended fence with the Kansas prairie spreading out in every direction around them, and she kissed him back, and it was the kind of kiss that is both entirely itself and also the beginning of everything else. The wedding was in June, conducted by the minister of the small Methodist church that had recently established itself in a proper wooden building in Caldwell, having spent its first year in a tent that the congregation referred to, with affectionate understatement, as the tabernacle. It was a small ceremony. The minister and his wife, the Hutchins family from the boarding house, Webb the old-timer who wore his Sunday coat and was clearly deeply moved by the whole proceeding though he would have denied it, and a woman named Clara Marsh who had the homestead to the north of Julia's, and had become Julia's closest friend in the way that neighboring women on the frontier become close. Through necessity and shared difficulty, and the particular intimacy of knowing what someone's life actually looks like up close. The children were present in their best clothes, Thomas standing beside Homer with a gravity that acknowledged the weight of the occasion without diminishing it, Charlie vibrating with an excitement that had less to do with the significance of the moment and more to do with the promise of cake afterward, and Annie wearing a wreath of wildflowers that Clara Marsh had helped her make and that she had not taken off since 4 o'clock that morning. Julia wore a dress of pale blue cotton that she and Clara had made together over the preceding 3 weeks, and Homer thought, watching her come down the short aisle of the little church toward him, that he was the most fortunate man on the Kansas prairie, and possibly in a considerably wider geographic area. He said his vows in the clear, straightforward manner of a man who means every word, and says it plainly because plain truth is stronger than embellishment. She said hers with the same directness, looking at him with those dark eyes that never looked at anything partially, and when the minister pronounced them married, he took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead first, gently, and then her mouth, and she laughed, which was a sound he was beginning to love as much as her voice when she spoke, low and real and entirely unperformed. The reception was a dinner on the grass outside the church, the Hutchins family having organized a considerable spread with the help of several other town women who took an interest in the Keene widow and were glad to see her well settled. There was chicken and corn bread and 3 different kinds of pie, and Webb made a toast that began with the observation that he had seen this coming since October, which made Homer laugh, and ended with a genuine and heartfelt wish for their happiness, which made Julia briefly press her lips together in the way she did when something moved her, and she was managing it with dignity. They went home to the homestead that evening, all five of them in the wagon, with Sergeant maintaining his customary air of reluctant participation. And Homer thought that going home with them, all of them, his family, was better than any destination he had ridden toward in 4 years on the trail. The summer of 1874 was a working summer, the kind that shapes a place and the people in it simultaneously. Homer and Julia worked the combined operation with the determined creativity of two people who have committed to a thing and are going to figure it out or wear themselves to the bone trying. Homer began building a horse operation, acquiring 3 mares and a good quarter-horse stallion from a rancher going south who was willing to sell at reasonable prices. And he set about the patient work of establishing breeding and training programs that would produce horses worth selling. Julia expanded the kitchen garden significantly and negotiated a contract with the Caldwell Hotel and the boarding house to supply produce through the summer months, which produced a reliable small income that mattered considerably during the lean season before the first horse sales. Thomas, now 10 and deeply serious about the ranch's business, assigned himself as Homer's assistant in the horse operation with the unilateral certainty of a child who has made a decision and sees no reason why the adults involved would not also recognize its obvious correctness. Homer was glad of him. The boy had a genuine gift with animals, a patient and attentive manner that horses responded to with the natural good faith that horses extend to people who approach them without impatience. He began teaching Thomas in earnest, not just the practical tasks but the thinking behind them, the way to read an animal's mood, the way to establish trust without force, the underlying philosophy of working with a creature that could kill you if it chose and therefore must be made to choose not to. Thomas absorbed all of it with the ferocious attention of a mind that has found its subject, and Homer found in the teaching a pleasure he had not expected, the particular satisfaction of watching something you know and love take root in someone else and begin to grow. Charlie, at 7, was less interested in horses and more interested in everything else simultaneously, which was a personality style that kept everyone in his vicinity both entertained and mildly exhausted. He was inventing constantly, building things from wood scraps and wire, and whatever else he could find, some of which worked and most of which did not, but all of which were the product of a genuinely inventive mind that Julia monitored with fond attention, and Homer encouraged with the tools and materials that inventions of this type require. Annie, at 5, had decided that she was in charge of the chickens, a responsibility she took with a seriousness that the chickens themselves did not particularly reciprocate, though they tolerated her authority with the philosophical pragmatism of birds who have concluded that humans are not their problem to solve. She named every one of them, kept careful track of the egg count, and periodically delivered to Homer and Julia formal reports on the state of the flock that were both completely accurate and delivered with a gravitas that would have been appropriate at a board of directors meeting. In the fall of 1874, Julia told Homer that she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning at the breakfast table with her usual directness and without preamble, setting his coffee down in front of him and sitting across from him and saying, "I am going to have a baby. In the spring, I think. April, maybe May." Homer set his coffee cup down very carefully, the way he had done once before at this same table, when she had told him something that changed his understanding of the geography between them, and looked at her face, which was watching him with the composed attention of someone waiting to see where things land. He said, "Julia," and then stopped, because what he felt was too large and too various to come out in a single moment. The joy and the love and the fierce protectiveness and the profound gratitude for the fact of this life they were building together. He got up from the table and went around to her side and knelt down beside her chair, which he was aware was dramatic and did not care about at all, and took both her hands and said, "This is the best thing I have heard in a long time, and I have heard quite a lot of very good things." She laughed, and there were tears in her eyes, and she did not try to manage them away this time. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Yes," she said, which was the word he had asked her about once before in the context of her life with Daniel, and she had answered carefully and with honest qualification. Now she said it without qualification, simply, the word being entirely sufficient to carry what she meant. "So am I," he said. The winter of 1874 into 1875 was milder than the previous one, which felt like a gift from the prairie in recognition of all the work that had been done upon it. Homer built a proper lean-to addition onto the soddy for additional sleeping space, anticipating the spring, and continued the barn improvements that the horse operation required. Julia, large with child and entirely unbowed by it, continued to manage the household and the produce business, with the magnificent organizational competence that Homer had come to regard as one of the great spectacles of his daily life. He was protective of her in a way that she occasionally found excessive and said so directly, because directness was her primary mode. She pointed out, when he suggested she might want to leave the barn work to him during the final months of her pregnancy, that she had birthed 3 children previously under considerably less comfortable circumstances and had managed each one perfectly well. "I know that," he said. "I do not doubt your capability for a single moment. I am trying to express care." She looked at him for a moment, and then her expression softened in the way it had learned to soften for him, the particular softening that was only his. "I know that too," she said. "I appreciate it, even when I argue with it." "I know," he said. "I appreciate that you argue with it." She shook her head at him with the specific look she had for moments when he said something that pleased her by being exactly the right thing, a look that was fond and slightly exasperated and deeply warm all at once. The baby was born on the 14th of April, 1875, in the small hours of the morning when the spring peepers were going full voice along the creek, and the sky outside the soddy window was thick with stars. Clara Marsh came and assisted, as she had for Julia's other children, and Homer was in the lean-to with the 3 older children, Thomas asleep and Charlie and Annie awake, and asking with considerable frequency whether it was over yet and whether everything was all right. It was. When Clara came through the door and told him he had a son, Homer sat for a moment with his eyes closed and his hands on his knees, breathing. Thomas woke at the sound of Clara's voice and looked at Homer with those serious dark eyes that were so like his mother's and said, "Is everyone all right?" "Everyone is very all right," Homer said. "You have a brother." Thomas nodded slowly, processing this. "What is his name?" Homer had not been in the room when they decided the final name, though they had discussed it for months, going back and forth between several options. He said, "We will let your mother tell you that," and went through the door to find out what Julia had decided. She was propped against the pillow in the dim light of the oil lamp, holding the baby with the competent ease of a woman who has done this before, and the particular tenderness of a woman who is also in love with the baby's father, which is an entirely different quality. The baby was red-faced and wrinkled and entirely himself, with a surprising amount of dark hair and a determined set to his jaw that was already identifiable. Julia looked up when Homer came in and said, "Come and meet your son." He sat on the edge of the bed and she put the baby in his arms, and Homer held him with the careful awe of a first-time father, the weight of him both insubstantial and enormous in the same moment. The baby opened his eyes for a moment, dark and unfocused, and seemed to briefly consider Homer with the mild interest of a very new person encountering the world and finding it, provisionally, acceptable. "James," Julia said. "I would like to call him James." "After my father." "James Merritt," Homer said, trying it. "James Daniel Merritt," she said, "if you do not mind." He looked at her, understanding the gift of that, the inclusion of the name of the man she had loved before and the children she had made with him, the acknowledgement that their story did not begin with Homer but was not lesser for it, that it was all continuous and whole. He was moved by it in the deep, quiet way that he was moved by Julia's gifts, which were always exactly right and always generous beyond what was required. "I do not mind at all," he said. "I think it is a fine name." The years that followed were full in the way that good lives are full, not always easy, not always smooth, but packed with living and growing and the gradual accumulation of things that matter. The horse operation grew into a genuine business, with contracts from the army and regular trade with ranchers and settlers throughout the region. By 1877, Homer had a reputation as one of the best horse breakers in the Caldwell area, known for producing horses that were steady and reliable, and trained without the harshness that was still, in that era, too common a method. Thomas had grown into a young man of 15, who was entirely at home with horses, and spoke about them in the informed and considered way of someone who has put serious study into a subject he loves. He rode with Homer on most of the trade trips to neighboring ranches, handling negotiations with a maturity that made buyers regard him with something between amusement and genuine respect, and he was saving money carefully toward the day when he might have a horse of his own to breed and sell. Charlie, at 13, had built a water-saving irrigation channel for the kitchen garden that actually functioned, which Homer declared to be one of the more remarkable things he had personally witnessed, and Clara Marsh had declared to be a miracle, which Charlie found tremendously satisfying. He was clearly going to be an engineer of some kind, which was a thing that the world of 1877 was beginning to have room for in ways it had not previously, and Julia was already planning how to get him the education that would develop what he clearly had. Annie, at 11, had expanded her animal authority from the chickens to include an extensive relationship with 2 of the mares, who followed her around the paddock with the devoted attachment of large creatures who have decided that a small human is their particular person. She was also, it had become clear in the past year, exceptionally good at arithmetic, which she did with the same offhand ease that other children applied to breathing, and which Mrs. Peters at the Caldwell School noted with the excitement of a teacher encountering a genuine gift in a student. James, who was 2.5, was conducting a comprehensive personal survey of all the spaces within a 1-mile radius of the Soddy, moving through the world with the confident exploratory manner of someone who has decided that all of it is interesting and his job is to investigate it. He called Homer "Duh," and had recently taken to addressing the mule sergeant as Sarg, which Homer thought showed excellent judgment. In the spring of 1877, the lumber for the new house arrived in Caldwell, and Homer and Julia and several neighbors who had agreed to a building exchange spent 3 weeks in May raising a proper 2-story frame house on the rise above the creek, close enough to the Soddy to use the existing well, but positioned to face east and catch the morning light across the meadow. It had 4 bedrooms and a proper kitchen, and a parlor with a window that looked out across the creek toward the cottonwoods, and when it was done, and the family moved in and Julia stood in the parlor for the first moment with the light coming through the window, and touching the spine of the poetry book that had been on every shelf in every home they had made together, Homer stood in the doorway and watched her face, and thought that this was the culmination of something. Not the end of anything, but the solid and visible expression of all the years of work and intention. She turned and found him watching her, and she said, "It is more than I thought it would be." "You built a great deal of it," he said. "We built it," she corrected, as she generally corrected any statement that left her out of something she had been central to, which was a habit he loved. "We built it," he agreed. She crossed the parlor and took his face in her hands, which was an unusual direction for the gesture, which was generally his move, and looked at him with the full weight of those dark eyes that had never once looked at anything halfway. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" she said. "Tell me." I think about that day in October in Pulem's store. I was standing at that counter, trying to talk him into a credit arrangement, and I could hear myself being very reasonable and very persuasive, and I was also, internally, very frightened, because the flour was almost gone, and I did not know what I was going to do if he said no. She paused. And then you came in and put that coin on the counter as if it were the most natural thing in the world. As if you just happened to have an extra $5 lying around and couldn't think of anything better to do with it. It seemed like the obvious thing at the time. You did not even know my face yet, she said. You only knew my voice. I knew enough, he said. She leaned her forehead against his. You knew enough from a voice through a canvas wall. It was a very remarkable voice. She laughed, that low and entirely real laugh, and he put his arms around her and held her in the new parlor of their new house with the creek running outside and the cottonwoods putting their first summer leaves up against the sky, and the children's voices, all four of them, drifting in through the open window from the yard outside. And the moment was so precisely and completely everything that Homer Merritt had not known he was looking for through 4 years of cattle drives and open trail. That he held it consciously and deliberately, pressing it into memory with the full attention he had. He had heard her voice before he ever saw her face. He had recognized something in it, not her specifically, because he had not known her, but something about the quality of the person behind it, the steadiness and the courage and the quiet refusal to be diminished by circumstances that had not been kind. And then he had walked through a canvas door and seen her face, and the voice and the face had come together into a complete and irreversible person who had rearranged the entire landscape of what he considered possible and desirable in a life. He had never forgotten either one. There were hard years after the good ones, because that is the honest nature of life on the prairie and everywhere else, and the Merritt family encountered their share of difficulties with the same combination of practical intelligence and fundamental optimism that had characterized everything Julia and Homer had built together. In 1878, a drought dried the creek to a trickle, and the garden struggled, and 2 of the mares did not produce healthy foals, and money was tight in a way that required careful management, and the kind of sustained equanimity that is not easy and is not luck but is character, plain and hard one. Homer handled it the way he handled all difficulty, by working and thinking and talking to Julia, who was his best counselor and most reliable sounding board, and by not allowing himself the luxury of despair, which was a luxury he had noted that the prairie could not afford. Julia handled it the way she handled everything, by doing what was possible and not wasting energy mourning what was not, and by making the most of the resources available with a creativity and efficiency that continued to impress Homer after 6 years of daily observation. The drought broke in the fall of 1878, and 1879 was a good year, one of the best they had had, with 3 outstanding foals and an expanded produce contract, and Thomas bringing in his first independent horse sale, a transaction he had negotiated himself with a rancher from south of Caldwell, and that produced a profit sufficient to begin his own breeding fund. Homer shook his son's hand at the table that evening, Thomas's hand now nearly as large as his, and said, "Well done," in the simple tone he used for things that genuinely merited it. Thomas, who had his mother's way of receiving praise, which was to acknowledge it briefly and move on rather than dwell in it, nodded once and said, "Next spring I want to discuss buying a second stallion for the operation. I have some thoughts about bloodlines." Homer looked at Julia, who was regarding their son with the expression of a woman watching a very satisfying piece of her work complete itself. "We will discuss it," Homer said. In 1880, Julia was pregnant again, which announced itself as these announcements tend to, quietly at first, and then with mounting physical evidence that required no declaration. She was 31 by then, and perfectly well, but Homer was attentive in the way he had learned to balance attentiveness with her independence, which was to say that he was present and watchful without making it her problem to manage his worry. This baby came in October, which Julia noted was a fitting month given its father's particular history with October, a point that Homer found genuinely funny and genuinely true. It was a girl this time, small and dark-haired, who arrived in the world with her eyes already apparently trying to open and assess the situation, which Julia declared was entirely characteristic, and whom they named Alina, after Homer's sister in Missouri, who cried when she received the letter and wrote back 4 pages of genuine joy. James, who was 5, received Alina with the magnanimous tolerance of a young person who has already been through the experience of new siblings and understands the routine. He explained to her, on her 3rd day of existence, the general organization of the family, who was in charge of what, and what she could expect in terms of daily schedule and animal assignments. Alina apparently listened with great attention, or at least did not interrupt him, which James considered a promising start. By 1882, the Merritt Ranch had grown into something that stood on its own feet with the solid confidence of a thing properly built. Thomas, now 18, was effectively running the horse operation with Homer's guidance, and was beginning to bring his own ideas to it that were, Homer admitted to Julia one evening with honest pride, better than some of the ideas Homer had started with. Charlie, at 15, had gotten hold of a book on engineering principles that had come into the Caldwell General Store among a box of miscellaneous goods, and was teaching himself from it with the devoted intensity of someone who has found his life's material and is not waiting for anyone's permission to engage with it. Annie, at 13, was the best student Mrs. Peters had ever had, according to Mrs. Peters herself, who had become the kind of teacher who stays in a place partly because of one particular student and knows it. James was 7 and Alina was 2, and the house was full of the productive noise of a family that was, in all the ways that mattered, thriving. One evening in the late summer of 1882, Homer and Julia sat on the porch of the frame house after the children were in bed, in the companionable quiet that they had developed over 9 years of marriage, the quiet of 2 people who know each other well enough to be silent together, without any of the silence going to waste. The prairie was dark and enormous around them, and the sky above it was absolutely crowded with stars, the way the Kansas sky gets on a clear August night when the air is clean and still. Julia had the poetry book in her lap, the one he had given her for Christmas in 1873, its cover now soft and creased with years of handling. She was not reading it, just holding it, in the way she sometimes held it when she was thinking about something. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "That day in October," she said, "the 1st October, I think about it sometimes." "So do I." "I was so frightened that day," she said, something she had told him before but he never tired of hearing, not because he was glad she had been frightened but because it was part of the real story and she told it honestly. Not of Pulam exactly, just of everything. The flour was nearly gone. We had been living on what I could make stretch for 2 weeks, and I could not let the children see it because Thomas would have felt he needed to do something at 9 years old and there was nothing for him to do. "You were remarkable," Homer said. "I was desperate," she corrected. "There is sometimes very little difference. And then you heard me behind you." "I heard a coin hit the counter," she said, "and then I turned around and there you were." "And what did you think?" She considered this with the full consideration she gave to all genuine questions. "I thought you were handsome, which annoyed me," she said, and Homer laughed. "And I thought there was probably a price attached which made me wary. And then you said what you said and went out to the wagon and loaded my supplies, and you were so completely without performance about it. No expectation, no ceremony, just doing the thing because it was the right thing." She paused. "And I thought that you were either the most genuinely decent man I had met in a long time, or you were very good at seeming like one. And now, after 9 years of evidence." She looked at him with those dark eyes that had never once looked at anything halfway, and the stars were behind her, and the August air was warm and still, and she had the poetry book in her hands, and the house behind them was full of their children and their life, and everything they had built from a voice through a canvas wall and a face in the amber light of an October afternoon. "Now I have no doubt," she said. He reached over and took her hand, the same hand he had first shaken in Pullham's store, still firm and capable and honest in the way of hands that work and are not ashamed of it. She laced her fingers through his and they sat together on the porch in the enormous and star-thick Kansas night, and the prairie stretched out in all directions around them as it always had, vast and indifferent and not a little beautiful. And Homer thought that a man could spend a lifetime trying to calculate how a life turns on a single moment and never get it fully worked out. He had walked through a canvas door in October 1873 because a voice had called to him through it, steady and dignified and quietly remarkable, and he had seen a face and known something he could not have explained if asked to and had never had cause to doubt. He had stayed when he might have ridden on. He had built when he might have drifted. He had loved, completely and without reservation, a woman who had loved him back in the same way, with all the honesty and all the directness, and all the vast and quiet competence of a person who does everything she does with the full weight of who she is. And the voice, after 9 years, was still the first thing he listened for in the morning, still the thing that oriented him the way the compass needle finds north, still the most familiar and most beloved sound in all the sounds the world made. And the face, turned toward him now in the summer dark with the stars behind it, was still, 9 years on, the thing that made his chest do exactly what it had done the first time he saw it, on the October day when the voice and the face had come together and changed the direction of everything. He never forgot either one. He never wanted to. They sat on the porch for a long time that night, long after the stars began their slow wheel across the sky and the prairie cooled toward morning. Julia leaned her head against his shoulder eventually, something she had done 10,000 times in 9 years, and that still felt, to Homer, like receiving a specific and particular gift. He put his arm around her and they were quiet together, and the quietness was full of everything they had made together. The children asleep inside, the horses in the paddock, the creek running over its stones in the dark, the kitchen garden that had fed a family through 9 growing seasons, the book of poetry that had traveled with them through 2 houses and 10 years of marriage, the fence line they had mended together, the barn they had propped up together, the life they had built from a chance encounter in a canvas store on a muddy October street, in a boom town on the edge of the Kansas prairie. Homer Merritt kissed Julia's temple, gently, the way he kissed her when words were insufficient, and he wanted her to know without them that he was entirely present, entirely here, entirely hers. She made a small sound against his shoulder that was not quite a word but was entirely an answer. The stars moved overhead in their ancient, indifferent way, and the prairie breathed around them, and the house held the warmth of the family inside it, and the August night was long and full and generous, the way nights are in that part of the country when summer is at its peak, and the land is at rest, and 2 people are exactly where they belong. They had come a very long way from a canvas wall and a coin on a counter, and a voice that a cowboy had heard before he ever saw the face that went with it. They had come to this porch and this night and this life and each other, and it was, by any measure that mattered, exactly and precisely enough. It was everything. In the years that followed that August night, the Merritt family continued to root itself deeper into the Kansas ground the way a cottonwood roots into a creek bank, finding the water and holding fast. Thomas expanded the horse operation and brought in a partner the following spring, a quiet and capable young man from Missouri named Garrett who had both horsemanship and business sense, and who proved to be exactly the kind of collaborator Thomas's ambitions required. Homer stepped back gradually from the daily operations, not from laziness or age, but with the deliberate intention of letting the next generation take the weight, which is a wisdom that comes to some men early and to some never, and had come to Homer at the right time. Charlie went to Kansas City for his engineering education in 1883, on a combination of his own savings and a contribution from Homer and Julia that they made without fanfare and without expectation beyond the hope that he would use it well, which he did, completely and immediately, and with the focused efficiency of a young man who has been waiting for his opportunity and is not going to squander a moment of it. He wrote home every 2 weeks, long letters full of technical descriptions and enthusiasms that Julia read aloud to Homer after dinner, both of them following the progress of Charlie's mind through the letters, with the quiet parental pleasure of watching something you have loved from its smallest beginning fulfill its own nature. Annie, at 17, was the best student in the Caldwell school, by such a wide margin that Mrs. Peters had begun writing letters to the County Education Board on the subject of what exactly Caldwell intended to do with a mathematical mind of this caliber, and whether it planned to let it be wasted on the reasonable grounds that it belonged to a girl. Mrs. Peters was a woman of considerable backbone on this subject, having devoted her professional life to the education of children, and having observed the systematic undervaluing of girls' abilities with a sustained indignation that had never cooled. Julia supported her efforts with the same quiet effectiveness she brought to all causes she believed in, writing her own letters and making her own arguments in the direct and cogent way that had been persuading people since she argued with Pullem about flour in 1873. By 1885, Annie was enrolled in the normal school at Emporia, the first in their family and one of the few young women from the Caldwell area to have made that particular journey, and Julia watched the wagon carry her daughter toward the Caldwell station with the expression of a woman who is proud beyond ordinary expression, and who is also, quietly and privately, adjusting to a household that is slightly smaller than it was. Homer took her hand as the wagon disappeared, and she held onto it with the firm grip that was entirely characteristic of her in moments that moved her. James, at 10, had appointed himself the primary assistant in the kitchen garden, with an authority that the garden seemed to respect, having developed a genuine understanding of soil and growing things that was different in character from Thomas's relationship with horses and Charlie's relationship with mechanical systems, but equally deep and equally focused. He could tell by the look and feel of the soil whether it needed water or rest or amendment, and he was beginning, Homer noticed with the pleasure of a man who sees a gift recognized in time, to understand the creek's behavior through the seasons and how to use it rather than fight it. Eleanor, at 5 in 1885, was showing signs of being exactly the kind of child that her parents might have predicted from a consideration of their combined natures, direct and curious, and utterly unintimidated by anything in her environment, with a particular fondness for sitting on the porch railing in the evenings when the sky was doing something interesting and reporting on it with great precision and great vocabulary for a 5-year-old. Homer suspected she was going to be, in the fullness of time, someone to reckon with, and this pleased him enormously. In the autumn of 1885, Homer turned 42 years old, which he marked with the equanimity of a man who has had a good decade and is not afraid of the next one. Julia turned 36, which she marked with the same equanimity and a cake that Annie baked and sent instructions for by letter, which the rest of the family followed to the letter and which turned out very well. They celebrated in the parlor with the window open to the October air, and the poetry book on its shelf, and all 4 of the children present or represented by letter or thought, and Homer looked around the table at the people who were his life and thought about October of 1873, 12 years ago now, a voice through canvas and a coin on a counter, and a woman turning around to face him with anger in her eyes and dignity in her spine. He told the story that evening, over dessert, in the way that couples tell origin stories when the right moment presents itself, and the children are old enough to find it interesting. He told it simply and honestly, beginning with standing outside the store with his hat in his hand thinking about boot oil, and hearing the voice come through the canvas, and walking in not because he had planned to do anything in particular, but because the voice had called him in the way that the right things do, without argument, without explanation. Julia added her version, the coin on the counter and the man she turned around to find, the assessment she had made of him and the careful wariness that had slowly, over the following months, given way to something it had never been before and would never be again with anyone else. She told it with the same directness she brought to everything, and Homer listened to her voice as he had listened to it for 12 years, with the same attention and the same recognition. The voice that he had known was remarkable before he knew whose it was. James, 10 years old and earnest, asked if Homer had known right away that he was going to marry her. Homer considered the question honestly. I did not think about marrying her that day. I thought about hearing her voice again. That seemed like enough to want at the time. And then, James pressed. And then I kept wanting to hear it and kept finding reasons to, until I could not imagine a life in which I did not hear it every day. He looked at Julia across the table, which I believe is another word for love. Julia looked back at him in the way she had looked at him 1,000 times, and that was always still the first time, and said, with the composure that was her mode and the warmth that was her gift, "You were a very persistent man. You were worth persistence," he said. Eleanor, 5 years old and sitting between them with cake on her chin, announced with the confident authority of a child who has reached a firm conclusion, "I think it is a good story." "So do I," said Homer Merritt. "So do I," said Julia. The October light came through the parlor window and lay across the table in the long gold way of October light in Kansas, and the poetry book was on its shelf, and the house was warm and full, and the creek ran outside over its stones, and Sergeant the mule, now ancient and considerably more distinguished than ever, stood in his paddock and contemplated the evening with the philosophical equanimity that had always been his primary mode. And Homer Merritt, who had come through a cattle town in the autumn of his 29th year, and heard a voice through a canvas wall that changed the direction of everything, sat at his table in his house in the middle of the vast and star-ready Kansas evening, beside the woman whose voice he had known before he knew her face and had never once forgotten either, and was, in all the ways that the word can mean, and several it has not yet found language for, entirely and unreservedly happy.